They captured him without firing a single shot. There was no exchange of gunfire, no visible resistance, no struggle. To any external observer, it looked like one more ordinary scene from World War II, an isolated American soldier surrounded by superior enemy forces, without immediate support, without a clear escape route. Just another man defeated by numbers, by circumstance, by the cold logic of war. Nothing about that image suggested heroism. Nothing hinted that history was about to bend around a single decision. But that afternoon in January 1945 would not be remembered as ordinary, because true heroism rarely begins with explosions or speeches. Sometimes it is born in absolute silence, when all that remains is the sound of your own breathing. Sometimes it appears when surrender seems like the only rational option. And in extremely rare cases, it begins with something completely out of place. Laughter, echoing where hope should not exist. It was winter in Western Europe, and not just any winter. It was a merciless winter, the kind that does not simply freeze the skin, but seeps into the bones, dulls the mind, and slowly erodes the will to continue. The cold offered no real rest. Sleep meant closing your eyes for a few hours, only to wake up shaking, muscles stiff, thoughts heavy, already exhausted before the day even began. Men froze to death in defensive positions. Others lost fingers, feet, sometimes their sanity. The war did not need bullets to kill. The winter handled that on its own. January 1945. The Third Reich was wounded and bleeding on multiple fronts, yet still extremely dangerous. Like a cornered animal, it lashed out with desperate violence. Every German advance carried the awareness that it might be the last chance to change an inevitable fate. Every counterattack was fueled by rage, frustration, and denial. Entire villages changed hands within hours. A barn could be American at dawn, reclaimed by German forces in the afternoon, and by nightfall turned into an improvised graveyard. It was within this unstable landscape, in a small Belgian village barely visible on most maps, that a single American soldier, unarmed, surrounded, and seemingly defeated, made a decision that would last less than a minute, but would enter military history as one of the most improbable and decisive acts of the entire war. His name was Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. At first glance, he did not look like a hero. Leonard Funk lacked the imposing stature seen on recruitment posters. He did not possess the broad shoulders or cinematic build associated with legendary warriors. He did not command attention when he entered a room. He did not intimidate. He did not project immediate authority. In any other context, you might have walked past him without remembering his face. He stood just over 5'3" and weighed barely more than 130 pounds. Compact frame, narrow shoulders, completely unremarkable appearance. Outside the battlefield, he could have easily been mistaken for someone assigned to clerical work. Far from the front lines, far from close combat, far from the constant presence of death that defined infantry life. That ordinary appearance may have been exactly why the Germans underestimated him. That single fatal miscalculation would cost 21 men their lives. Because Funk did not stand out physically, he stood out mentally. He carried something far more dangerous than brute strength: absolute control under extreme pressure. Born in 1916 in industrial Pennsylvania, Funk grew up surrounded by factories, steel, smoke, and economic hardship. The Great Depression allowed no extended childhood and no space for illusions. Survival came before ideals. Life taught its lessons early and without mercy. No one was coming to rescue you. Responsibility arrived long before adulthood. Those who failed to carry weight were crushed beneath it. Funk learned quickly. He learned that complaining did not change reality. He learned that waiting for help could mean dying while waiting. He learned that when something needed to be done, someone had to step forward. And more often than not, that someone became him. Not because he sought leadership, but because necessity demanded it. When the United States entered the war, Funk did not hide behind a safe assignment. He did not look for shortcuts or protection. When offered more comfortable paths, he refused them. Instead, he volunteered for one of the most dangerous roles available: the paratroopers. At the time, jumping from an aircraft into enemy territory was not seen as bravery. It was seen as madness. The doctrine was experimental. The equipment was crude. The risks bordered on suicide. Nearly half of all volunteers quit during training. Bodies broke, knees shattered, ribs cracked, minds collapsed. Strong men begged to be reassigned. Funk stayed, not because he lacked fear, but because he understood something fundamental. Fear never disappears. You simply learn to move forward despite it. Paratrooper training was designed to eliminate weakness, not just physically, but psychologically. Endless runs under heavy loads, violent jumps that rattled every bone, repeated falls until pain became routine, sleep deprivation, constant exhaustion. The goal was to break ego before combat ever could. Funk absorbed it all in silence. He watched others fail. He studied mistakes. He adapted. He was not the fastest. He was not the strongest. But he was relentless. And in war, consistency saves lives. When he finally earned his wings, he did not celebrate. He understood that the real test was still ahead. That test came over Normandy. When the Allied airborne assault began, the sky itself seemed hostile. Aircraft shook violently under anti-aircraft fire. Formations disintegrated. Paratroopers were dropped blindly into darkness, scattered miles from their intended zones. Many were killed before they ever touched the ground. Others landed in swamps, minefields, or directly among German positions. Funk landed far from where he was supposed to be. The impact twisted his ankle brutally, sending pain surging up his leg. Every step became agony. Still, he moved. While others froze or panicked, he began gathering scattered soldiers. Men from different units, some wounded, some disoriented, all searching for direction. They needed leadership. Funk provided it. He led the improvised group as if it were a regular unit, moving only at night, avoiding occupied villages, engaging only when absolutely necessary. Whenever danger arose, he placed himself between it and his men. For days, they operated behind enemy lines. When they finally returned to Allied forces, every man was alive. Not a single casualty. That was not luck. It was command. And command in war always attracts attention. Months later in the Netherlands, Funk would once again prove that he was no longer simply surviving the impossible. He was shaping it. The moment Leonard Funk Jr. began laughing in the face of a German submachine gun, that moment did not come out of nowhere. It was not madness, not a sudden break under pressure, not a heroic impulse born in desperation. That laugh was the final expression of something that had been forming for years, something shaped slowly by hardship, discipline, and repeated exposure to situations where hesitation meant death. To understand why Funk did what he did in that frozen Belgian courtyard, you have to understand that by January 1945, he was no longer reacting to danger. He was operating inside it. Danger was his normal state. Leonard Funk Jr. was born in 1916 in Pennsylvania, into a country that would soon forget what comfort felt like. His childhood unfolded alongside the collapse of the American economy, when factories slowed, wages disappeared, and families learned that stability was an illusion. In that environment, boys did not grow up dreaming of greatness. They grew up learning endurance. Funk learned early that complaining solved nothing, that waiting for help was often pointless, and that responsibility usually fell on whoever was willing to carry it. This background did not make him loud or dominant. It made him quiet, observant, and reliable. Those traits rarely stand out in peacetime. In war, they become lethal. When the United States entered World War II, Funk did not seek safety. He did not angle for a rear echelon role or a position that minimized risk. Instead, he volunteered for the airborne infantry, one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire U.S. Army. At the time, airborne warfare was still experimental. Paratroopers jumped from low-flying aircraft into darkness, often under fire, with unreliable equipment and minimal intelligence. Injuries during training were common. Fatalities were accepted as part of the process. The Army did not advertise this as heroism. It was seen as calculated insanity. And yet Funk stayed. Airborne training was designed not merely to condition the body, but to dismantle the ego. Endless runs, brutal physical drills, repeated jumps from towers and aircraft, sleep deprivation, constant evaluation. Men quit not because they were weak, but because their minds broke under the pressure of constant uncertainty. Funk endured by adapting. He did not try to dominate the training. He focused on consistency, on control, on learning how his own fear behaved under stress. He discovered that fear did not vanish. It narrowed. And if you could operate inside that narrow space, you could function when others froze. By the time he earned his jump wings, Funk was no longer thinking like a civilian. He was thinking like a man who expected chaos and planned to move anyway. That mindset was tested brutally during the Normandy invasion. On D-Day, the sky itself seemed hostile. Aircraft were scattered by flak and weather. Paratroopers were dropped miles from their intended zones, often alone or in small, disorganized groups. Funk landed hard, injuring his ankle badly enough that every step sent pain through his leg. Under normal circumstances, this would have ended his role in the operation. Instead, it became irrelevant. Funk understood that survival behind enemy lines depended less on perfect execution and more on immediate leadership. As he encountered scattered soldiers, men from different units, some wounded, some disoriented, he took command without announcing it. He organized movement, chose routes, avoided unnecessary engagements, and attacked only when the advantage was absolute. For days, Funk led that improvised group through occupied territory. They moved mostly at night, using terrain and silence as their primary weapons. Funk placed himself at the front when advancing and at the rear when withdrawing, absorbing risk so others could function. Every decision was deliberate. Every pause was calculated. When they finally reconnected with Allied forces, every man Funk had gathered was still alive. That outcome was not luck. It was proof of something far more important. Funk had become a stabilizing force in chaos, and officers like that do not go unnoticed. Later, during operations in the Netherlands, Funk faced another test that further hardened his approach to combat. German anti-aircraft guns were tearing apart Allied gliders mid-descent, killing soldiers before they ever reached the ground. Funk was given 3 men. The enemy had roughly 20, well-positioned and entrenched. Standard doctrine would have demanded reinforcement or artillery support. Funk understood that time was the critical variable. Every second meant more dead Americans in the air. So he attacked immediately. The assault was fast, violent, and direct. Funk did not attempt to overwhelm the enemy with numbers. He overwhelmed them with decisiveness. By exploiting surprise, aggressive movement, and relentless pressure, his small team neutralized the gun positions. The gliders landed. Lives were saved. Actions like that change a man internally. Once you have seen impossible odds collapse under decisive action, you stop seeing numbers the same way. You stop waiting for permission from circumstances. That psychological shift would matter more than any weapon Funk carried later. By the time winter descended on the Ardennes, Funk was already operating at a level beyond mere survival. The Battle of the Bulge was unlike anything most American soldiers had experienced. The cold was merciless, draining strength and clarity alike. Units were understrength, undersupplied, and often surrounded. The German offensive relied on shock, speed, and psychological collapse. In this environment, rumors spread faster than bullets, and none were more chilling than what happened near Normandy. The massacre of American prisoners by SS troops sent a clear message through the Allied lines. Surrender was no longer safe. The traditional assumptions of war, the idea that capture meant survival, were shattered. For Funk, this information did not provoke rage or panic. It produced clarity. Somewhere deep inside, a decision settled into place. He would not surrender, under any circumstances. This was not bravado. It was a logical conclusion drawn from observed reality. And once that decision was made, it simplified everything that followed. On January 29, 1945, Funk's unit was tasked with capturing the Belgian village of Holzheim. The company was depleted. Experienced officers were dead or wounded. Support personnel were being pressed into frontline roles. When the executive officer was killed, Funk assumed the position without hesitation. He did not give a speech. He did not pretend the situation was favorable. He told his men the truth. They were infantry now, and the mission had to be completed. The advance through deep snow was exhausting. German artillery harassed their movement. Visibility was poor. Fatigue pressed on every step. Yet Funk maintained momentum. Once inside the village, combat became intimate and brutal. Room-to-room fighting, grenades thrown into narrow spaces, sudden gunfire at point-blank range. Funk moved constantly, directing, engaging, adjusting. When the fighting ended, the result was remarkable. 30 German soldiers captured by Funk's company, none of his men killed. Additional prisoners taken by nearby units brought the total to 80. Victory, however, creates its own dangers. The prisoners were gathered in a farm courtyard, guarded by only 4 Americans. Funk knew the situation was unstable, but manpower was limited. For 20 minutes, the tension hung in the air, heavy and silent. Then Funk rounded the building, and everything changed. The prisoners had broken free. Weapons were being grabbed. Orders were being shouted in German. An officer stepped forward and jammed an MP-40 into Funk's stomach, screaming commands he did not understand. In that instant, Funk assessed the scene with absolute clarity. Nearly 90 enemy soldiers, 4 Americans, no secure perimeter, and no realistic chance of reinforcement. According to every rule of warfare, he was finished. And that was when he laughed. Not because he found the situation amusing, but because the decision had already been made long before. What followed, the grab, the turn, the shots fired in rapid succession, was not improvisation. It was the inevitable conclusion of a man who had spent years preparing his mind for exactly this kind of moment. And in less than a minute, the courtyard would be silent again. And in less than a minute, the courtyard was silent again. But silence in war is never empty. It is heavy. It presses down on the chest. It forces the mind to catch up with what the body has already done. Leonard Funk Jr. stood there with the MP-40 still in his hands, the weapon warm, the smell of burned powder hanging in the frozen air, and bodies scattered across the snow in positions that told a story no one would ever fully reconstruct. 45 seconds had passed. That was all. Less than a minute of motion had rewritten the balance of power in that courtyard. Yet for Funk, time did not immediately resume its normal pace. Moments like that stretch. They linger. They refuse to be contained by clocks. The German soldiers who remained alive stood frozen, weapons dropped, eyes fixed on Funk with an expression that blended shock, disbelief, and something close to fear. Not fear of death, that had already been present, but fear of unpredictability. The man in front of them did not behave according to rules they understood. He had been captured, he had been disarmed, he should have complied, pleaded, or collapsed. Instead, he had laughed, and then he had moved. Soldiers are trained to respond to patterns. Funk had shattered every pattern in a matter of seconds. Faced with that kind of disruption, surrender became the only remaining structure available to them. Funk did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not rush to assert dominance. His control came from the absence of unnecessary motion. He ordered the remaining Germans to lie down, to move away from the weapons, to remain still. His voice was calm, almost flat, as if issuing routine instructions during a drill. That calmness was not an act. It was the residue of a nervous system that had already discharged everything it needed to. Around him, his men began to emerge from cover, their expressions mirroring the disbelief of the prisoners. They had seen their officer captured. Then they had seen something else entirely. Only after the situation was secured did Funk finally allow himself to breathe deeply. The cold returned. The ache in his muscles returned. The reality of what had just happened began to take shape, not as emotion, but as awareness. He performed a rapid internal inventory, the way experienced combat leaders do. No immediate threats, no counterattack, his men alive, the village still under American control. Only once those facts were confirmed did the weight of the moment settle into his body. He did not celebrate. He did not speak about it. He simply moved on to the next requirement of survival. News of the incident spread quickly through the unit, then outward to other formations operating nearby. Soldiers talk. They always do. But stories change as they travel, shaped by adrenaline and disbelief. Some said Funk had killed more. Some said he had used two weapons. Some said the Germans had charged him. Funk never corrected these versions. He never elaborated. He never denied them either. In his mind, the event did not belong to myth or narrative. It was a solved problem. And solved problems are not revisited unless necessary. What mattered to the command structure was not the legend, but the result. An entire group of prisoners had attempted to rearm themselves. A potentially catastrophic reversal had been prevented by a single officer acting decisively under extreme duress. Investigations followed, as they always do. Witness statements were taken. Timelines were reconstructed. Funk answered questions briefly and without embellishment. His testimony was factual, stripped of drama. He did not frame his actions as heroic or exceptional. He described them as inevitable. That framing unsettled some of his superiors more than the violence itself. War has a way of rewarding outcomes while struggling to understand motivations. Funk's actions fit cleanly into neither category. On paper, he had done everything right. In theory, he had violated expectations of behavior under capture. The Army resolved this tension the way institutions often do, by focusing on the result and honoring it accordingly. Leonard Funk Jr. would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The citation would summarize his actions in clean, controlled language, compressing chaos into coherence. It would take minutes to read. It had taken decades to build. For Funk, the medal changed very little. He did not see it as a culmination. He saw it as an administrative response to an event that had already passed. He continued to serve until the war ended, carrying with him the same habits that had defined his actions in Holzheim: observation, restraint, decisiveness. When the war finally closed its grip on Europe, Funk returned home like millions of other soldiers, stepping back into a civilian world that could not fully comprehend what he had been required to do in order to survive. Like many veterans of his generation, Funk did not speak often about combat. Silence was not avoidance, it was economy. Words were insufficient to convey the internal mechanics of moments like the one in that Belgian courtyard. How do you explain the sensation of time slowing without sounding mystical? How do you describe acting without conscious thought, without sounding reckless? Funk understood something most civilians never need to. Extreme violence, when stripped of emotion, becomes a form of work. And work, once completed, does not demand storytelling. It demands recovery. Yet the story persisted, resurfacing in military studies, historical accounts, and quiet conversations among soldiers who recognized its significance. Not because of the body count, not because of the medal, but because Funk's actions revealed something unsettling and important about human behavior under absolute pressure. He did not rely on superior strength, numbers, or technology. He relied on psychological disruption. His laughter was not mockery, it was a weapon. It destabilized the enemy's expectations long enough for physical action to follow. In modern terms, it was cognitive warfare executed instinctively. This is what makes the incident difficult to categorize. It was not a last stand. It was not a desperate gamble. It was a controlled intervention into a collapsing situation. Funk did not wait for courage to appear. He acted on a decision that had already been made days earlier, when he resolved never to surrender. That decision removed hesitation from the equation. Once hesitation was gone, speed became possible. And speed, more than aggression, determined the outcome. Historians often ask whether moments like this can be taught, replicated, or engineered. The uncomfortable answer is that while training can prepare the body and sharpen skills, the decisive factor lies deeper. Funk's response was the product of accumulated experience, internal discipline, and a personal code forged long before that courtyard. He did not become that man in 45 seconds. He arrived there after years of adapting to pressure, learning how fear behaved inside him, and deciding again and again to act instead of wait. This realization reframes the event entirely. The 45 seconds in which 21 men died were not the story. They were the visible surface of something far larger. The real story was the years of quiet decisions, the repeated exposure to uncertainty, the acceptance of responsibility without recognition. Those elements converged in Holzheim, but they did not originate there. They would not end there either. Even after the war, Funk remained a man shaped by those internal structures. He built a life defined by steadiness rather than spectacle. He did not seek platforms or recognition. When asked about the war, he spoke in measured terms, emphasizing teamwork, preparation, and circumstance rather than personal valor. This refusal to center himself frustrated some interviewers and fascinated others. It was as if he understood that turning the event into a personal myth would cheapen the reality of what war demanded from ordinary people. And that is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Leonard Funk Jr.'s story. He was not extraordinary because he was fearless. He was extraordinary because he accepted fear as a constant and refused to let it dictate his actions. In that sense, his laughter in the face of death was not defiance. It was acknowledgement. He recognized the moment for what it was, a final test of a decision already made, and responded accordingly. The courtyard in Holzheim eventually returned to anonymity. Snow melted. Bodies were removed. War moved on. But moments like that do not disappear. They echo quietly through history, resurfacing when we examine the limits of human behavior under pressure. Funk's story forces an uncomfortable question. How many people are capable of acting decisively when all conventional outcomes are removed? And how many are quietly preparing for such moments without ever knowing it? Because if there is one truth embedded in what happened there, it is this. History does not always turn on grand strategies or overwhelming force. Sometimes it turns on a single decision made long before anyone else realizes it matters. And Leonard Funk Jr. had already made his. Long after the gunfire stopped in that frozen Belgian courtyard, long after the bodies were removed and the weapons collected, long after the snow erased the immediate evidence of violence, those 45 seconds continued to exist. Not as noise, not as motion, but as a quiet fracture in time. A moment that refused to shrink into the past the way most moments do. For Leonard Funk Jr., those seconds did not replay as images or sounds. They settled instead as a certainty, a confirmation of who he had already become long before anyone else noticed. In the days that followed, Funk did what soldiers always do after surviving something they were not supposed to survive. He returned to routine. Reports were written, positions were reinforced, orders came and went. The war continued, indifferent to individual moments of extremity. To the outside observer, what happened in Holzheim could be framed as extraordinary. To Funk, it was the logical endpoint of a chain of decisions that had started years earlier, perhaps even before he ever put on a uniform. When the opportunity to surrender had appeared, he had already removed surrender as an option from his internal map. Once that path was closed, only one direction remained. When the official account was assembled, it struggled, as all official language does, to compress chaos into coherence. The citation for the Medal of Honor spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. These words were accurate but incomplete. They described what Funk did, not how or why he was able to do it. They could not capture the silence inside his mind at the moment he laughed, the absence of hesitation, the calm acceptance that whatever happened next would be final. Medals can recognize outcomes. They cannot replicate internal states. Funk accepted the honor with the same restraint that had defined his conduct in combat. He did not seek attention. He did not reshape his identity around the moment. When asked about it, he redirected credit toward training, toward the men around him, toward circumstance. This was not false humility. It was alignment. In Funk's worldview, actions did not require mythologizing. They required accountability. He understood something deeply uncomfortable for those who prefer clean narratives. The line between heroism and survival is often indistinguishable from the inside. After the war, Funk returned to civilian life, as millions of others did, carrying experiences that resisted translation. He built a life defined by steadiness rather than spectacle. He worked, he raised a family, he aged. The war receded into history books, documentaries, and anniversaries. But for those who knew the story, or who later encountered it, the question remained, how does an ordinary man perform an act that seems, on the surface, impossible? The answer is not found in strength, speed, or even courage, at least not courage as it is commonly imagined. Funk was not fearless. Fear was present in every major action he took. What distinguished him was his relationship with fear. He did not treat it as a signal to stop. He treated it as information. Training had taught him how to function while afraid. Experience had taught him that hesitation was more dangerous than decisiveness. And moral clarity, sharpened by events like the Normandy massacre, had removed ambiguity from his choices. In the absence of ambiguity, action becomes simpler. This is why the laughter matters. It was not mockery, it was not madness, it was disruption. In that instant, Funk seized control not through force, but through psychological inversion. The Germans expected compliance, panic, or submission. Instead, they encountered something that did not fit their mental model of a captured enemy. Confusion followed. And in combat, confusion is fatal. Those 45 seconds were not driven by rage. They were driven by tempo. Funk moved faster than the situation could stabilize against him. Once momentum shifted, the outcome was sealed. Military historians often analyze battles in terms of numbers, terrain, logistics, and doctrine. Funk's story resists that framework. On paper, the situation in the courtyard was unwinnable. There was no tactical advantage, no superior positioning, no numerical parity, and yet the situation collapsed in his favor almost instantly. This forces a re-evaluation of what advantage actually means. Sometimes advantage exists not in material conditions, but in internal alignment, the complete synchronization of decision, intent, and action. The significance of what happened in Holzheim is not that 21 men were killed. War, tragically, produces numbers like that every minute. The significance lies in the demonstration of how a single, resolved individual can dominate a moment that appears, by every external measure, to be lost. Funk did not wait for permission from probability. He acted from certainty, and certainty, when paired with speed, can overwhelm even overwhelming odds. As years passed, Funk's name surfaced periodically in discussions about leadership under pressure, about combat psychology, about the limits of human performance. Yet he never became a symbol in the way some heroes do. He did not represent glory or triumph. He represented something quieter and more unsettling. The capacity of an ordinary person to act with absolute clarity when stripped of all comforting illusions. That clarity is not glamorous. It is not cinematic in the traditional sense, but it is real, and it is rare. The irony is that Funk himself likely never framed his actions in such terms. He would have rejected the idea that those 45 seconds defined him. From his perspective, they were simply the moment when preparation met necessity. Everything that mattered had already been decided before the trigger was pulled. The real battle had taken place internally, over years, through repeated exposure to fear and responsibility. The courtyard was merely where that internal structure became visible. And this is where the story ultimately closes its circle. At the beginning, Funk appeared as just another captured soldier, isolated, surrounded, disarmed. To any external observer, he was powerless. By the end, it becomes clear that he was never truly captured at all. Not mentally, not morally, not psychologically. The Germans controlled the space, Funk controlled the moment, and in war, moments matter more than maps. Those 45 seconds did not change the outcome of World War II. They did not alter the grand strategy of nations, but they mattered profoundly because they revealed something timeless about human behavior under extreme pressure. They showed that when all external options collapse, internal decisions remain, and sometimes those decisions are enough to bend reality, however briefly, in a different direction. The courtyard returned to silence. The war moved on. Leonard Funk Jr. went home. But the echo of that laughter, so out of place, so defiant of expectation, remains. Not as a sound, but as a question. What would you do if everything told you it was over? Because history is not always shaped by armies, or leaders, or even battles. Sometimes it is shaped in less than a minute. Sometimes it is shaped by a man who has already decided, long before anyone else realizes, that surrender is no longer an option. And sometimes it is shaped in 45 seconds that never truly end.